Now, as this channel has grown in the past few months, I've read a ton of comments. I'd sometimes see a couple of new users like Alexandrite, and I'd usually see a couple of reoccurring users like Machine Court and Nitro Zeus. They'd sometimes make me laugh, sometimes give me further insight into the franchise, and basically make me feel like I've made someone's day. But no comment stuck with me the way that Kaffa Grigus fans did. They basically wrote about their fan-made Skylander called Punch Crunch, and they went freaking hard on their backstory. It's a lot to go over, so I'll leave the Elves video in the description and pin it in the comments, but that comment specifically stuck with me for days. This hasn't happened to me in a long time, and that's when I got to thinking. I have a side passion for drawing custom characters, and I also love building with Legos in my free time, especially when I'm using the CCBS system, which is an extremely underutilized system that did not deserve the fate it got. So why not try something new this time? I decided to make 3 custom Skylanders and give them backstories and gameplay styles, because 1, I don't want to just go over the lore of these characters, and 2, I actually want to use gameplay footage that isn't SWAT Force footage for the umpteenth time. So before we begin, I need to point out something about most of the characters I actually show in this video. The drawn characters technically are not mine. They are just drawings using a character creator as a base, so the link to the original work is in the description down below because the artist deserves credit for their original work. The drawings also have Gacha Life assets as well, like shoes, so I need to be very careful with these. But since Gacha Life exists as a genre on YouTube and they make a ton of money off of it, not to mention that the original assets are edited and redrawn all the time, I think I'm safe. But with that out the way, let's get to the first fan-made Skylander of today. Silence is a mostly silent, moderately tall, and somewhat slow Arkeyan robot of the tech element. He's roughly the size of your average SWAT Force member, and when I was creating him, I wasn't really trying to make him look Arkeyan-like since he's meant to be a robot who tried to distance himself from the Empire. But with that out the way, let's get into his history. Silence used to be one of the very few Hands of Arcus, the microscopic number of near-infinite robots in the Arkeyan Empire that served directly under the Arkeyan King, and sometimes the Arkeyan Queen. Even though Silence and his group were led by a queen, there's barely any information on her. But from Silence's personal account, we do know one existed, and that Silence himself was more loyal to her than he ever was to the king. During his service under the Empire, he was a robot of few words, carrying out his duties with absolute precision and professionalism. And after he put down a dragon rebellion all on his own, claiming one of the petrified wings of a fallen dragon as a weapon of his own, the queen saw his potential and promptly promoted him to her right hand. As he excelled in destroying rebellions, preventing coups, and keeping the Empire's enemies in line or destroying them without leaving a trace of their existence, he would become a feared ghost story for dissenters, a boogeyman that scared the rebellious citizens to their very core, and he was only known as the Silence. During one of his many battles with a local uprising, he would come across a heavily damaged Arkeyan elite. Most of the time, he would ignore the soldiers if he ever came across them, but something was different about this one. There was something about this elite that he came across that managed to crack Silence's blackened exterior, which caused him to step in and help before the elite met his demise. The elite would thank Silence, asking him about his well-being, and after nodding, all Silence could really say in response was to chop chop. There was still a rebellion to end. After this, he would, with the Queen's blessing, check up on the elite from time to time, learning that his name was Chop Chop, and slowly growing close to the elite barely his size, the only being he could really call his friend. Months after this, he was sent on his final mission to regain control of the closest mining operation near the city of Arcus that suddenly went silent. When he arrived, he investigated around the facility only to encounter 8 absolute giants who weren't too pleased with his presence there. Realizing that they were responsible, he fought them to the best of his ability, grazing a few of them before one of them smacked him into a wall, knocking him out cold. When he came to a few days later, he couldn't get in contact with the king and queen. In fact, he couldn't get into contact with anyone inside the city of Arcus or out, and for the first time in his existence, he felt a sense of dread wash over him. Not dread, fear, but not for himself, but for his friend back at the city. He immediately rushed back to the city, only to meet up with Chop Chop, where the two decided that it would be best to continue to follow their orders until the Arkeyans returned, because in their minds, the Arkeyans would return, right? But as time went on, Chop Chop wanted to figure out why they were left behind, why they were abandoned, and why their creators left them here. But Silence believed that they should stick to their orders and stay in the city. But this would all come to a head one day. Chop Chop would attempt to make his way to the surface on his own, only to be stopped by Silence. Silence pleaded with his best friend to turn around and go back to the city, that what he was doing was treasonous and that he was betraying their empire. Chop Chop, however, told him to get out of his way, that they weren't tools and they deserved answers. This escalated into a duel between the two, a duel that Silence lost, losing one of his arms and having to let his only friend go. After this, he began to question everything he had done up to this point, and after realizing that he was serving an evil empire only out for power in his eyes, he left the city and went on a new mission: destroy as much of the Arkeyan's histories and weapons as possible, so their empire could never rise again. He would go on for centuries, destroying everything related to the Arkeyans in any way until, in his mind, everything was gone, except for one thing: the Core of Light, where he would once again go on to face his old friend, Chop Chop, who just happened to be standing guard that day. Instead of having a battle of blades like they had done centuries prior, they instead had a battle of words, where Chop Chop would manage to convince him to fight for a new purpose, protecting Skylands like the Arkeyans should have. Silence changing the golden red highlights of his armor to silver and blues, keeping the black the same and holding onto the sword and his name to remind himself why he was leading this new life as a protector of the innocent. But with that over, let's get into his gameplay. Silence's kit actually consists of 4 different attacks, which sounds absolutely wild, but stick with me for a second. His first main attack consists of a slow swing. Think of it like every heavy attack in a hack and slash game. It's pretty slow, but it does a large amount of damage, and is wide enough to hit multiple enemies, so you aren't 100% screwed when enemies begin to bunch in. But this is where your second attack comes in. Your second attack is an extremely fast spin attack that is meant to knock enemies back and do a moderate amount of damage, giving you time to breathe, and this is where the other 2 attacks come into the picture. If you press the Y button or triangle button on your controller, Silence will let go of his sword and it will float upwards next to him, and when you press your main attack, his sword will spin into your nearest enemy, striking that enemy twice before quickly floating back to Silence's side. And to increase the amount of enemies hit and the speed of the sword, you can charge up the attack by mashing the second attack button, which also releases a secondary close-range electric shock. Think of it like using the saber throw in the Force Unleashed games, if you have to mash a secondary button instead of holding the same button down to charge up the attack. All in all, this creates a fun gameplay loop that not only incentivizes strategy, but feels like 2 Skylanders in one. But with Silence out of the way, let's get into our next Skylander of today. When it comes to our next Skylander, Vinegrow is a small elf of the life element the size of Sprocket that is mostly reliant on plant-based attacks. I actually had a lot of fun drawing him and getting to actually experiment with some of my drawings, especially with his cloak and pants. But with that out the way, let's get into his backstory. Vinegrow lived most of his life in a drow village located in the Great Jungle, a large jungle island that many considered to be one of the largest in Skylands. The area the drow village was in neighbored a forest consisting of borealis trees, large magical trees that can be used in multiple different magic spells and enchantments. Due to the fact that he had short ears and gray skin, he was constantly made fun of by the other drow children, and feared by the adults he lived with. And when it came to the trees themselves, he wasn't allowed to go near them for fears that he was undead, which could cause the sensitive elemental trees to wilt. Desperately wanting to prove himself to his kin and see the trees with his own eyes, he would practice day in and day out in the deepest parts of the jungle with other plants, discovering how to control the strongest of them and teaching himself how to bend them to his will, and even learning how to rapidly grow vines and other plants off of his skin. Over time, he would grow detached from the elves, but never fully letting them go, because even though they constantly made fun of and barely respected him, he was terrified of being completely alone in the world. But he would manage to meet someone that would change his life forever. On a particularly uneventful day, he sensed something in the forest and decided to go investigate, only to find Stealth Elf fighting some of his sentient plants. So in a panic, he quickly stepped in and stopped the fighting. Once everything calmed down, Vinegrow immediately asked what she was doing in the Great Jungle and why she was attacking his plants, and she quickly explained that the elves here have been cutting down the endangered borealis trees and selling the wood to chaos. And at first, he thought she was lying. All elves, even the drow, loved nature and would do anything to protect it, and he believed that the drow wouldn't do such a thing. But once Stealth Elf showed him what was left of the deforested trees, he realized that the drow cared more about serving evil than protecting what was left of an almost extinct tree. Once he realized this, he quickly told Stealth Elf where the village was and offered to guide her to it, and she thanked him for it, both of them heading into his village and managing to break into and destroy the wood mill where the trees were being processed. Before leaving the mill, however, he managed to find a few undamaged seeds and pocket them. But since he never wanted to associate with the village again, he asked Stealth Elf if there was anywhere else for him to go. She was the first person in his life who didn't judge him for the way he looked and actually treated him like a person, so he was beginning to see her as a good friend. And she offered to take him to the academy to become a Skylander, which he accepted. After arriving at the academy, he would notice a small, somewhat desolate island nearby, which he would go to and plant the seeds of the Borealis tree, and use all of his power to cause them to grow into one massive tree, getting to see the glowing Borealis-like wood and star-like leaves for his own eyes, and vowing to himself that he would protect what may be the last of the Borealis trees as a Skylander. So with that out the way, let's get on to his gameplay. Vine Glow has a main attack that is a mix of igniters and smolder dashes, which allows him to move while swinging his vines the same way he would while he's walking, that has moderate range. For his second attack, he stops in place and throws a cluster of explosive seeds, and he will throw more that does more damage the more you upgrade his ability tree. And his final attack is when he launches his hands into the ground and shoots spikes up from the floor when enemies are close up. But with that out the way, let's get to the final Skylander of today, which I would have said if I actually timed this properly. Unfortunately, Stitchcraft is still baking in the oven right now, so I'll just have to make her a second video along with a second fan-made character, but this is where I'm gonna cut this off. But before I go, I'd like to say, if this video does well, I will make a part 2. So send this to your friends, send this to everybody you know, just to prove to me that you want to see something like that. But with that out the way, thank you for watching. Like always, hit the subscribe button if you enjoy content like this. Share this around so I can grow as a channel. Leave some comments down below to make the algorithm happy. And once again, I will see you all in the next one.